Let's move over to our wide receiver start-sit segment. Some pretty big names on here as well as some super deep, slowly emerging options. We'll hit on all of them here. The first one, though, Jarvis Landry, who just does nothing but deliver wide receiver 2 performances every single season, it feels like. Doesn't matter who, what situation, what QB, what other wide receivers he's competing with. And over the last 2 weeks, he's put up over 20 fantasy points. Those games against Jacksonville and the Tennessee Titans. Now goes into a Week 14 matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, who are 12th against the wide receiver. But on this tear, are you willing to throw Jarvis Landry back in? Because I think he's right in that flex category for me.
Yeah, I think so. I'm certainly willing to flex him. We thought this was going to come when Odell Beckham went down, just the influx of targets. In the first couple games, we were disappointed against Houston and Philly. Only 5 targets, 2 targets, really, really tough fantasy weeks. But we got to remember, both of those games were in abysmal weather, like super windy, raining, and both teams were keeping it on the ground. I think the Houston score was like 10-7. So that is really why we didn't see Jarvis produce there for a couple weeks. Last 2 games, 11 targets and 10 targets, 28 and 20 fantasy points, even in a tough matchup against Baltimore. I think it's going to be a competitive game. If the Browns have the ability to just run the ball, they're going to. We saw it in the second half against Tennessee. Baker had like 300 yards and 4 touchdowns in the first half and didn't do much in the second half because they were just running the ball. So I do think they're going to need to throw it. Jarvis should be involved, should be a 10-target guy this week. And anytime you're getting 10 targets, I think that's someone you can flex regardless of the quarterback. And we were talking before the show, Steph, Baker's been playing better than people give him credit for this year throughout the whole season. So I'm willing to start Jarvis Landry this week, even in a tough perceived matchup against Baltimore.
You can almost look at Jarvis Landry like Stephon Diggs light back last year, over the last couple of seasons when Kevin Stefanski was in Minnesota. It's certainly a run-first team, but this is the guy that they're going to go to who can make big plays for them, has had a touchdown the last 2 weeks. I think they're going to use him. And so with all that being said, Jarvis Landry, lock him in as a strong flex play or a desperation wide receiver 2, even in a tough matchup against Baltimore. Another guy in a tough matchup who's been in this category, he's been in our start sits a lot this year. He's been a guy that's had a lot of polarizing opinions said about him. It's Devonta Parker, who has a matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs. They're second in the league against wide receivers. How are you valuing Devonta Parker?
I don't want to start him this week, and I hate to say it because I love Devonta. We're both Louisville guys, big Devonta Parker fans, but without Fitzpatrick, we've just seen his value kind of level off, and the volume just isn't quite there. He's had a couple games where he's gotten into the end zone with Tua that have definitely elevated his value, but, last week, 4 for 35 just isn't going to get it done, where the week before he had 8 for 119 with Ryan Fitzpatrick. So you can just easily see the difference in Devonta Parker's performance with and without Ryan Fitzpatrick. Now, Tua definitely does like to throw the ball to Devonta if he's going to throw it to the wide receiver position. So, I'm trying to fade Devonta Parker this week against the Chiefs, who are good against the wide receivers. Tua has really liked throwing to Gesicki at the tight end position. Their defense has been strong this year. They've ran the ball fairly well. So I'm trying to fade Devonta Parker if possible, but if you have to flex him here, I totally understand it. The Dolphins should have to be throwing the ball through the duration of this game. But I'm probably trying to fade and bench Devonta Parker if I can.
I'm surprised you're that low on it because you think about how this game script is going to play out. I think the Dolphins are going to need to throw the ball a ton. And I think Devonta Parker's a guy who can deliver should the target volume be there. Of course, we love him with Fitzmagic. Fitzmagic's a guy that's just going to throw it up, eyes closed, and say, I think Parker can go out and make a play. Tua's not that way. Tua's more cut from the same cloth as like Baker Mayfield, where he's not going to have this alpha X wide receiver that goes bananas every single week. He's going to target the tight ends. He's going to target the running back. So you look at that and, yes, it just certainly caps the floor for Parker, but the matchup, to me, dictates that he should be a low-end wide receiver 2, a locked-in flex play this week. And like I said, I'll talk about Myles Gaskin later.
I think you changed my mind. I think you changed my mind. I think I would be willing to flex Parker.
The live on the show flip. We throw those takes out there. Love to see it. See, you're not listening to guys here who are locked in, stuck in on these takes. They're willing to change it with new information when the right discussion, the right points are brought up. So hit us up in those comments with your thoughts. But I'm willing to plug in Parker this week. Now, a guy that I'm not willing to plug in, I'm curious if you feel the same way. It's Keke Coutee, wide receiver for the Houston Texans, who absolutely exploded against your Colts last week on 75% of snaps with Will Fuller now out of that lineup. Caught 8 of his 9 targets for 141 yards. Also had a few, for those of you in leagues that reward kick return and punt return yardage, he had some of that as well. He's used in a lot of different ways in this offense. Is QT a guy that you're willing to go back to the well with after a big week? I even saw in some leagues, some deeper leagues, people were plugging him in there, and he paid off, delivering 22.1 fantasy points in PPR leagues. Week 14, though, against Chicago, are you in or out on QT?
I'm out. I mean, if he had a big week, would it surprise me? No, but I'm just not counting on it. It's a tough matchup against Chicago. I'm just not banking on the targets being there. Last week, he saw 9 targets and turned it into 8 for 141. That's a super efficient game. I think they will need to utilize him and get creative, but I'm just not expecting them to be able to go downfield to QT like they were able to do last week. So I'm out on QT this week. He's a boomer bust option. Someone, if you're desperate, you can throw in there, but I definitely would take Parker, Landry, even DJ Chark, who we talked about earlier on the show, over QT this week.
The thing that gets you excited for QT is his speed, right? He's a 4.43 guy, but he's a little undersized, 5'10", 181. He plays in a lot of different positions over the field, but primarily in the slot. Plays in the slot on 60% of his snaps. So he's interesting. I think he's an interesting flex flyer, but not a guy that you want to start if you're making a playoff run. If you're having to plug in Keke Coutee, your roster's probably on its last leg, and you're fighting tooth and nail just to get into the playoffs. So if you're a contending team, if you feel strong, you have other options. You have a Jarvis Landry, Devonta Parker, even some other guys that we'll talk about here like Corey Davis. Willing to plug in all those guys over Keke Coutee this week, even though he did have a boom game, and I'm happy for him. But let's talk about Gabriel Davis, another rookie who had a great performance against the San Francisco 49ers and has really been playing well over the last couple weeks. Against the Chargers, had 16.9 fantasy points, 3 receptions and a touchdown. Against San Francisco, another 3 receptions and a touchdown. Looking at me like a guy who's getting inflated by the touchdowns that he's scoring. I don't think you can lock in those every single week, but taking over that John Brown role has had some significance for this Bills roster. But against Pittsburgh, are you willing to roll out Gabriel Davis?
No, I think he's a good stash in Dynasty. He's shown a lot of flashes this year. Last 2 weeks, playing 97% of snaps, almost identical stat lines. He went 3 receptions on 4 targets for 79 yards and a touchdown. Then he went 3 receptions on 4 targets for 68 yards and a touchdown. And even with the snaps he's playing, the targets just aren't quite there. He's a big play guy, very dependent on those touchdowns, and he's just a boomer bust option. He's someone, if he gets into the end zone, he'll give you a solid, 15-ish point week, and if not, you're going to be disappointed. So I'm sitting Gabriel Davis, and I'm not rolling those dice here in the first round of my playoffs.
If the matchup was anyone but Pittsburgh, I'd feel a lot more confident. Give him Atlanta, give him Seattle, give him Minnesota. But considering it's Pittsburgh, I expect them to be able to shut down at least some element of the Buffalo passing offense, which makes me really scared for Gabriel Davis. Would feel much more confident with like Cole Beasley. And I think Stephon Diggs is still a matchup-proof stud wide receiver. But for Davis, he's a fun rookie. He's exciting, but I don't think you can plug him in. Last one here, Corey Davis against Jacksonville. They're 28th against the pass. And Davis just finished as, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Alex, I think he was the wide receiver 1 last week with 35.2 fantasy points, 78% of snaps, 12 targets, caught 11 of them for 182 yards and a touchdown. I'm fully prepared to go back to the well on Corey Davis. He's on a hot stretch over the last 4 weeks with 11, 16, 10, and 35 fantasy points. You add in the Jacksonville matchup, super soft. Davis, I think, is actually a smash play. Might be a guy I'm looking at in DFS, depending on his price. Are you with me on that?
100%. I mean, Steph, In a good matchup, would we consider sitting Terry McLaurin or Chris Godwin or Mike Evans or Deontay Johnson, Cooper Kupp? Would you consider sitting any of those guys in a good matchup? Probably not.
No.
Corey
No.
Davis is averaging more fantasy points per game than every single guy I just named so far for the full season. More fantasy
Wow.
points per game than McLaurin, than Godwin, than Tyler Boyd, who has gone off when he had Joe Burrow, than Mike Evans, Deontay Johnson, Claypool, Juju, Cooper Kupp, DJ Moore. I mean, Corey Davis is wide receiver 26 on the season, and he's missed 2 games. So to me, he is an every week start. You gotta, if you can't find room for him in one of your wide receiver spots, I think you flex him, especially in a good matchup. I think he's a top 24 wide receiver this week. You got to keep rolling him out there. Tannehill is playing great as well. The defense is bad on Tennessee. We talked about it earlier on the show. They're in these shootout type games. I think Corey Davis is a must start.